Hello, everybody. Thanks, Anya and Clement, for the invitation to talk today. I'm happy to share this small block with our colleagues from Berlin. I'll pick up a bit on the political dimension of housing at the beginning and at the end. I start with this image, which is of the Spreefeld in Berlin, a cooperative where I live and work. I want to emphasize the political dimension of the cooperative housing, but also the emphasis on qualities. The architecture is important, but in the end, I think the social architecture is the most important, and if the people aren't happy, then don't do it. So this is a picture of some of us working in the garden sometime in the last year, which emphasizes this idea of cooperation or collaboration. Why do we do this housing? Because we want to live together and work together. That's my name, from Berlin. The title, Housing Metamorphosis. So I'm going to be talking about stuff from Berlin. That's where I've been living and working for the last 25 years, but I'll show you some other things from a few other European cities. And I'll be emphasizing this idea of inclusion and integration. The organization, a nonprofit I've been directing for the last 15 years or so, Institute for Creative Sustainability in Berlin. What else do we do? My organization, the Institute for Creative Sustainability, we organize networking and a bit of infrastructure. So on the research and development side, communication side, networking side, for this landscape of cooperative housing in Berlin and more internationally. We organize events since 2003. Every year, the Experimentdays is something like a housing market. So people that organize these kinds of participatory community projects come together, they present themselves, and people looking for a project go there to hopefully find a project to work with. Since also about 10 years, we've been doing an online platform, a database of self-organized housing for the Berlin region. I think right now we have about 100 projects on there, covering the range of cooperatives and Baugemeinschaften and so on. We do a kind of a research, so we've been following the development of co-housing and cooperative housing for the last 10 or 15 years. This is part of a publication we did a few years ago, identifying the various roots of cooperative housing coming from especially the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Switzerland, Holland, Germany, and then being bounced around the world. And I guess that's part of why we're here today, is being part of this international networking and putting of heads together, which is quite important. We did this publication a few years ago, CoHousing Cultures, a review of projects in about 9 European cities. We'll be leaving a few copies of our publications with Anya after the thing today. The emphasis of this book and the emphasis of our work is the cultural dimension of housing. So, of course, it has a technical or an environmental aspect, but if we don't start with the local culture, meaning the people where they are, so for example in Ljubljana, understanding the history, the tradition, what people's fears and dreams are, then you're not really developing appropriate housing for those people. A publication or a research project which will end up in a publication, we started this just in the last months, CoHousing Inclusive, realizing that this co-housing movement or cooperative housing movement is also challenged to be more inclusive, to be more integrating, to be more affordable, in the sense that the Meat Sources Syndicate to work as much as possible, wherever possible, to avoid speculation if we're thinking about the long term and sustainability, and recognizing that more and more people are having a hard time, not just in Ljubljana, but in all of our cities, of just having access to the housing market. So coming back to this city, I realized I spelled the name of your city wrong. I'm sorry for that. I looked at this many times, and I think about it every day. Is there another L or is another J in there? And now I realize there was another L in there. But so the next time I come back, I'll get it. Some things are similar with Ljubljana, of course. In all of our cities, the cities are growing, the rents are growing, gentrification is happening. The governments do not have a housing policy that's working, if they have any kind of a housing policy. So is there a crisis? Yes. It depends what city you're in. In some it's much worse than in others, but there's definitely a crisis. I think that's what's driving you all here to organize this kind of an event. So what's behind that? I sum it up in this sentence. The kinds of housing that we need as people in our cities is not being provided either by the government or by the market. What does that mean? Self-organization, civil society gets itself together. In the past, in cities like Berlin, they were squatting buildings. Today, that's not happening as much, but it means people are organizing things because these needs are not being met, and people, as we say, are taking the situation into their own hands. It doesn't mean that everything has to be completely private. I'll come back to this. We're looking for cooperation. It's not just between squatters or anarchists and their friends, but also with the government and with banks, foundations, and so on. Is there a demand for cooperative and co-housing? I think we would agree yes. We have to look a little bit closer, though, at what that means. What kind of cooperative housing or what kind of co-housing? Co-housing, the way I describe it, the way we describe it in our work, has three fundamental points. Self-organization, so this is not just participation. This is really helping people to realize the kind of housing that they want or that they need. Community-led, so it's not just a number of individuals living next to each other in a building. People are sharing spaces, sharing some activities. There's an idea of cooperation. The idea of sustainability is there, although I don't want to push that too hard to expect every project to be perfect. And when I say sustainable, I don't mean the environmental dimension first and foremost, but I mean things like affordability and democracy. Okay, so cooperative housing, again, for which people? Are we doing it for ourselves? Are we doing it for our friends? There are a number of different target groups, and I think any one of these groups is okay. I think we just need to be honest. Are we developing housing for the middle class, which is okay? Are we trying to develop it for lower income people? It's also okay. Do we want to include refugees and immigrants, or maybe even people who are really low income or unemployed? A bigger challenge. We just need to be direct and honest about what that is, and that will tell us what kinds of structures we can use, what kind of support we need. Why are people doing co-housing? Just to summarize that, a list from research, discussions, reports that people have been doing over the last years. In times like these, let's say times of insecurity, the world is crazy and getting crazier. People are looking for stability, they're looking for community, and looking for people to work together or live together with. I think it's not just driven by these negative forces. I do see a search for community. I think it was said in Zurich, the city is half singles. Berlin, more than half of the people are single. So we have extremely individualized societies. That leads to loneliness. It's also not sustainable. People use more square meters per person. But it is a part of the loneliness is something to be taken seriously in that sense. It's driving a lot of people to look for friends and neighbors, and housing is one place they do that. There is an environmental side. I mean, coming from Slovenia, and you have campaigns like Enough, and we talk about the shared economy. And that's definitely part of the movement. There's an idealism, not just on the social side, but people want to do what they can to save resources and protect the environment. Okay, what's the question here? I'm going to see in your information about this event or about this conference a model, and my point here is don't just look for one model. I think it's about options in a city like Ljubljana, definitely in a city like Berlin or Zurich or Wien. We need a number of options. Our cities are getting more diverse. The way we live and work together is getting more diverse. We're becoming more international. We need options. So the structures then. So if we're talking about the models, I think we're talking about definitely a strong private initiative or a private foundation, private positively defined here. So we're not talking about private investors or speculators, but civil society. People want to do things for themselves or for each other, a bottom-up kind of an interest. But there are a number of other possible ways to cooperate. A private project could be exclusively a squat. It could be an independent cooperative that has no support for the government. But to support our projects, we realize in times like this we need support from the government, so we need to look for ways to work together with our local cities, or maybe with our federal governments, or with nonprofits. Just some of the ways we describe them in Germany. Of course, the Mietshäuser Syndikat is one of them. The squats is definitely something that's influenced our thinking about self-organized housing in Berlin, but other structures, community land trusts coming out of England or the United States, of course cooperatives and other versions. I'm going to go into a few specific examples, and when we're looking at these, I want to just focus on a few of the main questions. So what are some of the main factors that go into the definition of a self-organized project? Who owns the land and the building? Very important. What are the structures for organizing the people, for making decisions? Who are the partners of the project? So is it the government, a bank, foundation, something else? Where's the money coming from, or are there any kinds of subsidies? So I want to start off by going up to the north, up in Sweden, Stockholm. The people in Scandinavia have a pretty strong history of sharing spaces, living together, cooking and eating together. A project here called Fjärdknappen. The concept is called living in the second half of life. So you have older people who don't want to go to a retirement home. They want to live in a kind of a self-organized community. And they don't want to live with children anymore, but they want to live with people that are older than 50, let's say. Cook and eat together every day, work in the garden, clean the house, do excursions and so on, keep each other active. One of the main points about this project is the building was built by a city housing company, a city housing authority. They built it with this group way back at the end of the 1980s, around 1990. So the point here is that self-organized groups don't have to do everything, or shouldn't always have to do everything for themselves, which is something that we thought we had to do in Berlin over the last years. Sometimes it's good to look for strong partners who have resources, who have land, who have access to funding. A group like this can give the project a direction. They can move in and pay a rent. They don't have to buy it. They shouldn't have to buy it. They pay the rent, but it's self-organized. Dominated by women. That's true for cooperative projects. A lot of women, I think men think about these things, but apparently the women are the ones that act on it, and so cooperatives are overwhelmed by women. They're happy that the men cook in the kitchen. Or they force the men to cook in the kitchen. In Sweden, they have very strong regulations, so there's a cooking plan, and everybody has to cook and clean up and so on. Go on to another project from Amsterdam. Amsterdam, I think, as we all know, has a beautiful city, has a shortage of land, so they're always creating new land out of the water. This is the new island, just on the edge of the downtown. And on this island, they invited only self-organized projects to build either housing or commercial spaces. This is the largest of the projects, where about 150 people are living now. A very important point here is that the city did not sell this land. As Amsterdam, I think, stopped selling land more than 100 years ago. They basically only lease it to residential projects, maybe for 50 years. Something that we try to get the city of Berlin to think about, maybe it's something for Ljubljana or for other cities, when possible, to not sell the land, to keep it in the hands of the city, but to lease it for a long term. This can help make the projects affordable in the beginning and gives the city or the local government a bit more power over the long term to help make sure that housing is staying affordable, or that the uses are staying the way they were agreed to. Another very nice thing about this project, this comes back to one of the points that Andreas was making with Zurich and Merrill's Wohnen. The scale is quite important, and when we get to these bigger projects like this one, you can have people living and working there, as well as education, things like a daycare, a theater, as well as outside outdoor spaces for the neighborhood. So you're creating a neighborhood, and you have a lot of possibilities that are important for sustainable development. This is summertime in Amsterdam. At least there's some blue sky, but you can see people wearing their coats. They have this kind of an interior courtyard, so at least the wind isn't as strong, but it looks like they're enjoying their outdoor space anyways. Let's go on to another project in Berlin, the Alte Schule, an old school. Like most of the Mietshäuser Syndikat projects, in the first 2 decades, a reuse or renovation is typical of Berlin. Up until about the last 10 years, almost everything was a reuse project. We had a lot of empty buildings. Of course, that was more affordable. This is an old school. It was owned by the city. It was sold, and this is very interesting as a model. The land was sold to a nonprofit foundation, and the building was sold to a cooperative. The cooperative leases the land from the nonprofit foundation, and this cooperative, called the Selbstbau, has about 25 projects right now in Berlin, part of a cooperative network. And each project, similar to the Mietshäuser Syndikat from the project, you have a network, but each project is self-organized and independent. So the people living in each building can decide basically how they manage themselves. And when somebody moves in, those people can decide who moves in. This project is very important for the idea of inclusion or integration. In Berlin, the concept of intergenerational housing has become important. So different from Sweden, where the old people want to live with old people. In Berlin, you have a lot of old people who want to live with children, interestingly enough. So bringing together singles and older people with families. A big part of this project. Another part of it is accessibility. Recognizing that we have a lot of people in the city who, they don't just have little money, but people with handicaps who need accessible apartments. And this project made a big emphasis on that. Also including a special group for young people who can't live with their own families. So in a number of ways, working to be inclusive and integrating, and emphasizing the question of affordability. So the ownership of the land from the nonprofit foundation combined with the ownership of the building by the cooperative, basically guaranteeing that the rents will not go up in the next 50 years. Okay, come back to the project where I am living and working. I assume Florian's going to talk a bit more about the Spreefeld Cooperative, so I'm going to focus on a project in the project called the Spreeweg. This means Wohngemeinschaft or Wohngruppe. It's a shared living group. So you see the 3 buildings in the new cooperative. My little project, which I helped start, well, now it goes back 5 years, as one of the shared living groups or a cluster apartment group. In one of the buildings, we have 2 floors, 800 square meters, 21 people, 12 private apartments. What does that mean? 15 adults, 2 children, 4 teenagers. The idea of self-organization, the idea of direct democracy, very important. And so the question of scale, once again, needs to be talked about. For me, that's really expressed here. The project of the Spreefeld altogether, it's not as big as Merelswonen. You have more than 1,000 people living there. We have about 130, 140 living there, maybe about 60 or 70 people working there. But we have these smaller projects that allow for us to develop community or to have a direct democracy or, at a level where we can share a kitchen and cook and eat together. So you can see in this image, back in the construction phase, I think that was 2013, approximately. That's what became our kitchen. Very important in the Spreefeld. Lots of opportunities to do things. You can look at it in a positive way as opportunities, save money, but meaning spending a lot of time finishing the project. Sometimes we say the project's never be finished. Some people are not happy about that, but some of us like the process orientation, like myself, and I think, the eternal challenge. This is what the kitchen looks like in the last year. Here you see also a lot of women on the table. There are almost half of the people in the group are men, but it just happens on this evening that mostly women were sitting there. That's a typical evening. 10 people, 15 people maybe come together where we're basically cooking and eating. So coming slowly to the summary, a metamorphosis of the city and its housing. So on the one hand, and now I'm getting kind of coming full circle to the politics, the political dimension of housing. We can see that housing in any city over the months and years responds to the economic and political situation and develops. But we can also see that the city responds to the housing. And my point here is to look at this over time, and you don't just see it in a month or a year or 10 years, but look at it in a time of 10 or 20 years and see how the cities develop, see how the city develops, see how the housing develops, and how they influence each other. And then to ask the question, is this political or isn't political? Probably in Slovenia, most people would say it's not political, it's a private issue. I want to buy my apartment, that's my decision, that's what I own. Don't bother me. If I have money, I should be able to buy my home. My point is it is political, and it's something that needs to be talked about by the government, by students, by architects, and so on, to think about where our cities are going and where our housing is going. Because the way we develop our housing over the long term definitely impacts the city. Is it affordable? Is it inclusive? Is it attractive? Is it healthy? Is it making people sick, or is it helping them to enjoy their lives? So where are our cities going? So now I'm really getting to the conclusion. What's happening in our cities, I think there's no question they're being globalized. The populations are being polarized. The cities are being gentrified. People are being mobilized, which means we're being put under pressure to not stay in one place. I know this because I came to the United States originally. I fled that country and I went to Berlin. But I see the same things happening in Germany. People are being forced to be mobile and flexible, and this is not good for the sustainability of the city. Cooperatives tend to want to work against that, to encourage people to stay in one place, to take some ownership for a neighborhood, to invest in a place, and to think about the long term. And then we ask ourselves, I mean, what do we really want? Should the cities be more democratic? Should they be sustainable? Should they be just, attractive, or more human? And so what's happening with our housing? I'm sure this is the case in Slovenia. It's individualized, definitely privatized, right? I mean, if the ownership rate is more than 90%, it's already long since privatized. And you have neighborhoods and cities that are segregated, which can be dangerous for the long term in terms of people not understanding each other or fighting each other. So what do we want from our housing? I'm not saying we all agree exactly on these points, but I think these are things we need to ask ourselves as architects and people in the government. And I see here my English is mixing with my German. Participatori, or maybe that's Slovenian influence. I'm saying, or I think that's probably something we agree on here. Housing should be participatory. It's a good place to practice urban democracy, give people a chance to influence their own housing, maybe even their own neighborhood. What about the social qualities? I don't want to force co-housing on anybody, or I don't want to tell everybody they should share a kitchen. I think it's not for everybody, at least not for everybody for their entire life. Maybe some people want that or need that. What about accessibility, including refugees, immigrants, and so on? And finally, now I'm really at the conclusion. I come back to this point about the qualities. This is a photo from the Spreefeld. Once again, a big part of my work there is with the landscaping and the outdoor spaces, and an image of a gardening action. We use the word subotnik. Maybe you understand the word subotnik here too. I don't know. Saturday actions, coming from the influence from the Cold War. People used to be forced to do so-called voluntary actions on Saturdays. We do these subotnik actions. They're more or less voluntary, and we do things like work in the garden together, but because we don't have money, we don't want to spend money on it, and we try to encourage each other to do things like plant fruit trees. But people, and you can see in the photos, I think really do enjoy it, and it's leading to a nice environment for us and spaces that we can share with the neighborhood and the city around us. So I think that's it. Thanks for your time and attention. And
so I have a question concerning the relation between community and individual privacy. When we did a project at the university here at Faculty of Architecture, we kind of had a problem how to decide which parts should be communal and which parts should be private, and how to have this reasonable exchange between community and privacy. I know this is a decision of the individual group. They can live in 1,000 square meters with whole communal space together, or they can have private flats. So any advices on that level?
I think in any case, I like to use the term self-organization, because I think it's really important to empower people and to help people do what they think they want or what they think they need. And at the same time, I think we really have to recognize that we need experts, so-called experts, architects and others, who have experience with these projects, because it is quite complex, and it's amazingly complex. The architecture, the spaces, the kinds of spaces between public, semi-private, and so on. And people who don't have experience in these projects really have a hard time grasping that. They need input, they need examples, they need inspiration, they need to be challenged with some questions. So it depends on a really nice discussion. I mean, Robert and Enrico were talking a bit about that. There's a bit of back and forth of communication between architects and so-called naive, what did they call themselves? Naive and motivated groups, yeah. So motivated is good, but most groups are naive when they start. So they need somebody to help them to be realistic. But I think there's another word that's good for that, the user orientation. I believe in that. I mean, if we believe in this idea of direct democracy, then we have to trust people to a certain extent that they want to do the best thing for themselves and that they can also make mistakes and that the results will not be perfect, but that they can improve on that. So really and that's the job of the architect, or I like the word facilitator in English, to get the best out of these people and to combine that with external inputs. And otherwise, the only thing we can say is, I think for each project, to try to optimize the balance between this private and community. I think in every case today we want a balance, right? I mean, maybe there are some groups looking for a real commune where there's no private space, but my guess is that's not so often these days. That people like to have a small space, at least that they can go back to and close the door, and a place where they can go where nobody can tell them what to do. Yeah, that's a long answer to the question.
Any more questions?
How do you include either people with really low income or unemployed, and how do you include sans-papiers, the people that don't have documents, that cannot work legally? In this, do you have some examples how this is done?
In terms of including people who have lower income, then typically you're going to have to look at the project. I mean, unless you're squatting a building, which is also possible, or you have the luck to find an older building, like they've done sometimes in Germany, a building that many people don't want, that doesn't look so nice. At least a lot of people think, yeah, I know who wants to live there. Stasi building. So typically these kinds of projects go to buildings or pieces of land that other investors don't want to use. So that's a realistic part. You know, live with noise, go to a street where other investors are not developing. That's just the reality. There's a nice thing about cooperatives, especially larger projects, is that you can include some people in the group who either have very little money or at least no investment capital. So even with a project like the Spreefeld, which is a completely private project, we can include a number of people who otherwise would not get a loan from the bank. So we work with the one bank, the environmental bank, the Umweltbank, and the bank knows that there are people in our group who don't qualify for loans, but they say that's okay, the cooperative is responsible for them. So that's also, for this reason, again, it's necessary to have a larger project. Otherwise, the future, I think, of affordable cooperative housing is more like what we see in Switzerland, where you have a stronger cooperation with the government. In Berlin, we're coming out of a history where everything was private and everybody was happy with that. Yeah, we can squat buildings and we do everything for ourselves and it's great. But we can't do that anymore. Berlin is too expensive now. So we need to learn from Switzerland or maybe Sweden, in countries where you have a better cooperation between the government and these kinds of groups. Otherwise, access to land is impossible. Otherwise, you have to leave the city. Yeah.
To you.
Thank you. Actually, I have a question for Miethaus Syndicat, if possible. It's a large network, large organization, and I'm curious how many paid staff do you have as an organization, and also are there paid staff in projects, in individual projects? And actually, my question is about how do you deal with people that don't want to be bothered with self-management and governance and all that. They just want to pay the rent and, live their life.
Okay, for the whole network, there's one employer, half staff, half time. Because also we just, or the regional counseling, there are people who are just support the idea. So they go there and we don't take money for our support. So it's more kind of a mutual network in this kind. So for the projects, they decide themselves. You have the project autonomy, they decide which contracts they give outside of their own organization, of their own self-organization. And I think it's a good solution. So they discuss at their place what they need, what maybe they need from the market. And the same for the aspect of self-organization and who is involved and who is not involved. They manage and then they set their own rules at this point. So in some kind of projects, people just are renters. We have one project in Freiburg. There are 200 people and 200 renters, and they have some kind of administration, paid administration, and there are much of students that are just living in the project, but they have the possibility to join the organization. There are some open doors to join the organization, and they have also paid staff. But it depends on the project. It's a project thing of project autonomy, and for the whole network, it sounds so great and so much work, but it's many people who are just taking part in the network. And there is some kind of administration work where we say, okay, it's okay that somebody is paid for it. And in this case, it's also that one project pays for the network, half of the stuff, So that's the solution in our network. And it's working like that. And the other part is, you can imagine for the project, if there are some architects and all the stuff that's normally paid, or sometimes you're underpaid because you have also some kind of idealistic, there's some idealistic approach for you. So they are also sometimes just say, okay, it's much of discussion, it's much of work, but we don't take the normal prices or something like that. There are sometimes some idealistic point also in this work. But for the project itself, there's a business plan and all this, and for the settling of the project, we pay. And it's repaid by we just, the rents are just financing the project later on.
So we have two hands, so we have time for these two questions. If they are short, then after that we have a break.
I would just compliment on the question about refugees, sans-papiers, and really poor people. You said that naturally for economical reasons they search cheap places that nobody else is interested in. I think this is a bit dangerous. We also say we have the strategy, we are poor but clever. So we take the places the normal investors cannot take. But if you do this with really poor people and people who do not speak the language of the country, or people who are cared out of their individual problems every day just to survive, then I think it's a bad advice to talk as we talk now, in self-organization and cooperative systems. It's a contradiction. I do not have a solution for this. But I think we should never give up the social state as responsible for society. If we let us care all the problems of the society, even the worst and the heaviest in this cooperative movement, then we get in a way of a neoliberal movement that takes away every responsibility from the state. We work with such people, and I make the experience that they need more normal circumstances, because they are so challenged by all-day life that we really have to provide them. They take the normal 3-room flat now, at the moment. And this, I think, is a very, very important issue. I do not have solutions, but I think we should be careful just to say, oh, okay, we can do this also. We can do this for the jobless and for the refugees and for everybody with our nice, beautiful little talk project.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I can't agree with them more that a lot of the responsibility of course, has to remain on the part of the government. As long as we're in a democracy, housing is a part of the society, and it's something that has to be provided or managed or developed. Just again, coming back to Berlin, what's the situation of the last 20 or 30 years? West Berlin and then reunified Berlin, a very strong idea, bottom up. If it's Mietwoordsyndicaat or if it's kinds of projects that I'm working with more, it's a kind of a privileged, self-organized civil society that's been doing nice projects more or less for itself. Not always for people with a lot of money, sometimes for people with little money. But again, because it's changing dramatically, that's not even possible anymore. So we're forced really to look more for these cooperations. And we're in the middle of a discussion of a creation of a new housing policy for Berlin. In a sense, Berlin had no housing policy for many years. And in that vacuum, a lot of projects like ours were developing when nothing else was being developed. So that's just part of our history.
You showed us a map. In the beginning from Europe with all the projects all over Europe, and my question is how you are involved in these different projects and how it's connecting this experience from all these different projects in your work. And this is the first time, and the second part of the question, what does it need that you get involved in a project in Slovenia? I mean, you have a lot of experience. We have it in Zurich, and you have it all over Europe. What does it need that you start a project or you get involved in a project in Slovenia?
Well, so the first question is, over the last 10 years or so now, with my organization, sometimes with the support of the city of Berlin, sometimes with the support of the European Commission, we were able to organize events, work on research projects, we do publications, which did a kind of a networking at the European level. So that was, we were able to travel and visit other projects. People came together in Berlin or in other cities, and that was important for me or for us to be able to compare and learn from these other things. Unfortunately, there's no stability at that level. There's no real good organized European network, so it's something that comes and goes. A few projects happen, and then it disappears again. So yeah, I've been fortunate enough to be able to travel around and meet people from other countries and cities and compare and do some writing about that. What does it mean when a project starts in Slovenia? I'm not a project developer, although my background is architecture, urban design and planning, and I like to say community development. My work is actually more communications, networking, research, development, and education. So if there's a role for me, it's more in terms of input or providing examples